Ethiopia, the nation of fairness, the symbol of freedom, the origin of mankind. Ethiopia Today is the English-language news channel which brings the latest from Ethiopia, mainly focusing on economy, digitalization, culture, history, tourism.
ኢትዮጵያዊነት ያስተማረን እውነታ በጊዜያዊ ችግር ተሸንፎ መውደቅን ሳይሆን ፈተናዎችን ወደ ዕድልና መልካም አጋጣሚ ቀይሮ ድል መቀዳጀት ነው።
Thanks for stopping by. I'm Brooke from Ethiopia Today. Our news focuses on Dr Hibist Kassa's analysis on the current situation of Ethiopia. Hibist Kassa is a senior researcher at the Institute for African. Dr Hibist Kassa's presentation is entitled Competing Narratives and the Crisis in Ethiopia. Let's listen to what Dr Hibist Kassa has to say. Since November last year, Ethiopia has been fighting a devastating civil war with the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Hibist Kassa argues that the scale of misinformation on the war, lack of context and attempts to impose false narratives is deeply troubling and pervasive. Kassa calls for a nuanced and historically grounded approach to properly analyse the course of events. Since 4 November last year, Ethiopia has been caught in a devastating civil war with the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, which has been marked by escalating genocidal attacks on ethnic minorities in Ethiopia. The scale of misinformation and disinformation on the war, brazen lack of context, shameless and downright dangerous attempts to not only impose false narratives, but also impose a narrow human rights agenda skewed to ignore abuses by Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, and its allies is deeply troubling and pervasive. At the moment, a dangerously simplistic and false narrative labeling the federal government as having an agenda for centralization, as opposed to the TPLF which is pushing for federalism, is being spread in mainstream media outlets and through scholarly networks. This is drawing on a further oversimplification of the history of empire building and contestation, and the nature of cultural and language identities and their relationship to class stratification. This year marked the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Odwa in 1896, a historic defeat of a European imperialist power by Africans, with the unification of divided peoples. Lords, serfs and slaves, women and men, mobilized an army of about 100,000 to defeat Italian troops in a matter of hours. The aftermath of the victory also laid the basis for further empire consolidation and forging of the modern state, a contested historical process that has been foregrounded in the current conflict. A nuanced and historically grounded approach is needed to analyze the ways the center-periphery tensions shaped autonomy in Tigray, recognize the wide spectrum of debates within the TPLF and how elites have deployed this in the current conflict. I examine this in some detail in the Agrarian South Bulletin here. While the need to get the analysis right on the crisis is important to inform interventions, we also need to understand the nature of the accumulation strategies of elites, the contradictions in these strategies and where this leaves the working class and the advancement of a progressive alternative from below. What are the competing narratives? At the moment, mediation is being proposed as was recently advocated in a statement by African intellectuals that eerily followed the line of the United States and TPLF on the crisis. A robust response by the Global Ethiopian Scholars Initiative and John Abing have highlighted the problematic nature of the statement and the need for an understanding of what is really at stake in the volatile Horn of Africa region, where a realignment of geopolitical relations between Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, with South Sudanese solidarity, is potentially decentering US domination in the region and sealing the decline of TPLF. Understanding the tricky and complicated context of the changes underway demands also for careful attention to what is left out of the dominant narrative of the crisis. For instance, it was shocking to hear pro-TPLF commentator Martin Plaut, and now visiting researcher at King's College Department of War Studies, declared boldly on the 5th of February this year that even though a massacre in Massacre in western Tigray was terrible, I don't care who carried them out. This was a genocide of about 1,000 men, the elderly and children who were identified as ethnic Amhara by TPLF youth groups. As the men were being slaughtered, women overheard them say they would come for them next. Zelalem Tesema, co-chair Ethiopian Association in the UK, who was on the same panel as Plout, said that this was the Srebrenica massacre of Ethiopia. Accountability, which was so important for Plout when examining Amhara militias, Ethiopian federal troops and Eritrea's involvement, was suspended in the case where TPLF militia and its youth members, who later escaped to join refugees on the Sudanese border. The TPLF has continued to commit atrocities in its vicious expansion into Afar and Amhara regions, displacing up to 4 million people. Meanwhile, a coherent campaign sympathetic to TPLF by the US, EU and UN, including the IMF and World Bank, have focused on aspects of the Tigray crisis, pressuring the Ethiopian federal government to revert to mediations with the TPLF. Even when a unilateral ceasefire was declared by the government, the TPLF has continued to encroach upon other provinces in Amhara and Afar provinces, temporarily occupying Lalibela and slaughtering civilians, destroying historic churches in Gondar. There was still no universal condemnation of the TPLF except for the instance where the USAID director in Ethiopia cited widespread TPLF looting of aid goods. There has also been complete disinterest in the killings of ethnic minorities elsewhere, which have been linked to the Oromo Liberation Front, OLF, openly allied to TPLF. In principle, violations by any state and non-state actor in Tigray and other parts of Ethiopia should be investigated, victims provided care and culprits held to account. But the geopolitical power struggle that is ongoing has no interest in this kind of accountability agenda. Instead, human rights violations, whether they be genocide, widespread rape, recruitment of children as combatants, and violations against Eritrean refugees, have been ignored when TPLF forces have been identified culprits. Talk of accountability and human rights is just a game in a bigger geopolitical battlefield. Getting the facts right is key. To make sense of what is an intensely complex crisis, it is important to focus on the following key facts. Firstly, on the 4th of November, after the federal government of Ethiopia had transferred $281 million to the Tigray provincial government, a lightning strike, so described by TPLF spokesperson, was unleashed on federal troops who were undertaking joint operations with the Tigray provincial forces. Unarmed soldiers and generals were slaughtered in their pajamas and their bodies left to rot, while other troops were taken as prisoners. Soldiers with specialized training were later summarily executed, ran over with trucks, and women soldiers were raped. When the news of this shocking attack trickled in, it horrified the general public and ended all attempts to mediate tensions between the federal government and the TPLF. Second, prior to the above attack, tensions had been building between the federal government based in Addis Ababa and the TPLF. The loss of TPLF's almost 3-decade dominance of power in the federal government had aggrieved the committee members. To recall, TPLF itself was a political party, with its own hierarchies and membership drawing from various constituencies within Tigray province. Thirdly, normalization of relations with Eritrea was an extremely significant change introduced by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in 2018. This significant change in foreign policy of Ethiopia was made possible under the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, IPROF, coalition with new leadership under Abiy Ahmed as a member of Oromo People's Democratic Organization, OPDO. It was a decisive break from TPLF foreign policy, which had treated the Eritrean government as a lethal enemy. The latter, which has acted as a bulwark against the expansion of the United States AFRICOM in the Horn of Africa, and retained some semblance of sovereignty over its national policy space. These former allies who waged war against the Derg, the military regime that ruled Ethiopia and Eritrea from 1974 to 1987, soon turned into foes over the TPLF's ethno-nationalist agenda entrenched in the Ethiopian federalist system, redrawing provinces and the entire governance system on the basis of ethnicity. Each province formed standing armies of their own and entrenched the right to secede in the constitution. Fourth, Tigray province is in the northernmost part of Ethiopia and shares a border with Eritrea, over which war was waged from 1998 to 2000, when Abiy was then on the front line as a soldier. A peace treaty was only signed in 2018 once the OPTO under Abiy was in power after a wave of popular protests against TPLF. According to Iqbal Jazbeh, former South Africa ambassador to Eritrea, since the peace treaty was signed, this provided Eritrea, a previously isolated regime which has stubbornly resisted being turned into a pawn by foreign powers, a bridge with which to expand its foreign policy influence in the volatile Horn of Africa. Asmara has resisted a regime change agenda, a challenge now facing Ethiopia, under the New Prosperity Party, PP, under Abiy, which has now had to resist pressure from foreign powers to dictate its relations with Eritrea. Fifth, the successful completion of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, has been resisted not only by Egypt and Sudan, but also with backing from the US and Israel. Although GERD was conceptualized and initiated by former Prime Minister Mullah Zenawi, its successful implementation did not have full backing of his heirs in the TPLF. The Metal and Engineering Corporation, a mega-parastatal, which was charged with manufacturing parts of GERD, manufactured them below expected standards. This delayed the project and has been suspected as an act of subversion instead of incompetence on the part of the parastatal. The combination of Egypt and Sudan, and the realignment of interests with internal actors, like the TPLF, and now OLF, has created another deadly alliance that threatens stability in the Horn of Africa. 6. Ethiopia is on the brink of national self-sufficiency in wheat production within 2 years. The Abiy government has also been setting up bread factories to ensure affordability for the urban poor and working people, especially in a time when food prices continue to skyrocket. In addition to the GERD and its potential to provide renewable energy resource to the Horn of Africa and beyond, these developments should be seen as efforts to strengthen productive capacity in the region and hopefully also address energy poverty that falls on the back of women. It is also a case that the infrastructure investments and industrial parks, especially in the garments industry, have had keen interest from global brands, but also significantly drawn upon domestic resource mobilization. All these are signs that concrete gains are being made in the country. 7th. Nonetheless, in spite of the Ethiopian government's commitment to liberalization, this has not enamored the regime to donors and the Bretton Woods institutions. Sanctions have been imposed on government officials to travel to the US. Conditionalities for loans are being attached to ensure mediation with TPLF. The interest of the IMF, primarily influenced by the US, in this conflict is noteworthy. 8th. Bretton Woods institutions, especially the IMF, have been attaching conditionalities to assistance, obliging the government to make concessions to the TPLF. This hard line towards the PP government is puzzling given that it has declared the country open for business, liberalizing one of Africa's last heavily regulated economies and allowing competition with state-owned enterprises, electricity and the telecommunications. The Abiy government has also been a very consistent partner in the war on terror, especially as it relates to operations against al-Shabaab in Somalia. 9. This indicates that there are higher stakes in Ethiopia's forging of alliances with Eritrea and Somalia and the broader goal to stabilize the Horn of Africa in a manner that has not centered Washington and its war on terror. Lawrence Freeman, on a panel on Ethiopia television, Addis Dialogue, argues that a global political oligarchic faction that maintains neo-colonial control of African countries in particular, sees any actor operating outside US control as threatening their dominance and needing to be dealt with as a threat. Deacon Yosef Tafari, chairman of the Ethiopian American Civic Council, concurs and emphasizes that the US had initially misread the Abiy government in the beginning of its tenure, and had to confront the reality of its more autonomous approach to foreign policy and its persistence with state-led developmental initiatives such as the GERD. It is this aspect that has informed a regime change agenda. Lastly, the TPLF, which was the dominant force in the previous coalition government, had been able to control the security and governance arms of the state and considerable investments in SOEs. It is an open secret that the TPLF had amassed offshore accounts of $30 billion. At its height, foreign aid reached $3.5 billion a year. $2 to $3 billion were lost annually through under and over invoicing of imports. Parastatals had become effective vehicles for accumulation of wealth by the top tier of the regime, with varied forms of patrimonial relations with less powerful actors within the party machinery. Proximity to power had its benefits, but none compared with the accumulation of wealth and deepening inequality that was apparent over the last 3 decades.
May God bless Ethiopia and its people. Thanks for your time, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation. Please give us a like, and share this to others. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you will be notified as soon as we upload new videos. And also feel completely free to comment. Thanks again.